here in Brazil, organized by GEM, Grupo de Estudos Medievais da Unimontes, which is the study group on medieval studies from the State University of Minas Gerais. And our conference was titled Global Medievalism. You can, in case you lost anything, you can check all the guest presentations on our YouTube channel, and we are ascertaining permissions for each individual speaker as well to get everything online, hopefully, or at least as much as we can. So look forward for that. And I would like to thank everyone who stayed with us until now. I know it's been 3 days and we had almost no breaks in this conference, so I can assume this has been very tiring for most of us. So yeah, thank you. And I would like to give special thanks to GEM on Unimontes, because without them, none of this would have been possible. And with this, I would just like to give the word briefly to Carolina, who is the coordinator of GEM, the current coordinator of GEM. She is an undergraduate student in the State University of Montes Claros, and none of this would be possible if it wasn't for her. Carol? Okay, she's not here anymore. Technical difficulty. Oh, she's rejoining. Yeah. Carol, with you.
Gente, vocês estão me ouvindo? E vendo também?
Yes.
Por enquanto, só ouvindo.
Eu vou começar a falar, então, provavelmente vai me aparecer em algum momento. Em inglês, então. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to greet the table, Louise, Dawson, Louise, Professor Vinicius, and everyone who is watching us now. As Louise said, my name is Carolina. I'm undergraduated in history at the State University of So the group was created based. Estão me vendo agora?
Yes, we are.
Bom, então, the group was created based on student-led initiative, and today I am here representing all the students members that are part of the group. So GEM, the group, holds bi-weekly meetings based on the proposed tests in this syllabus, and academics of history and other areas of knowledge are always welcome to participate. And people from all over Brazil participate in the meetings, and also national and sometimes international guests. So it's clear that we are not alone. We received support from professors and colleagues from other institutions. And this event makes that very evident. That's why I look to thank everyone who made this possible, the monitors, the table mediators, the invited professors, the public, but especially Vinicius Dreger and Louise Guerra, who worked hard for this event. So thank you very much to all of you. And now I hope you enjoy the last activity of the event, the presentation of the Louise Dawson, which will be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. So just one last thing. I would also like to thank our security team of monitors who has been taking a look at the chat with overzealous attention sometimes, and we're glad to announce that at least until now we had a attack-free conference. So thank you all. And starting the keynote, then I would like to present to you all Professor Louise Dawson from the Macquarie University in Australia, who will be presenting to us a keynote titled World Medievalism. And yeah, also we are live on YouTube. The link is on the chat. Do share with your family, friends, and whatnot. Thank you. Louise, with you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Do I just, I can just share my screen? Is that okay for me to do?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, great. All right. Oh, now did that come up okay? Hang on one sec. Hang on. I'm just trying to get the I can't do my slides because the toolbar is in the way of me being able to do that. Sorry, just trying
to. The Zoom
it's
toolbar?
Okay. Yeah, the Zoom toolbar gets in the way of. It's okay. I think I'm okay now. Is that okay? You can see that?
Yep, we can.
Great. Okay, before I get underway, let me just say thank you so much. The main person I've been in touch with over this has been Louise, but thank you also, Carolina. Thank you to everybody who's been involved in putting this together. I'm so impressed with what you're doing. And as you know, very excited by the idea of this medievalism from the South. And to that end, I'll be starting on that theme. And I guess I'll just get underway then. So, and to anybody who's heard little bits and pieces of this before, this is kind of a little bit of a précis of what I'm doing across the book that I've got in press that's hopefully coming out sometime later this year called World Medievalism. So I will get underway. Thanks. At the bottom edge of the map of the known world, in George R.R. Martin and Jonathan Roberts' The Land of Ice and Fire, is the coastline of a dense green landmass. The expanse of this land is uncertain, but its headland hints at a vast continent stretching south. Its continental scale is also suggested by the word written across it, Sothorios, a name which, like Essos and Westeros, condenses an entire compass point into a single body of land. This southern land is rarely mentioned in Martin's novels, and HBO's Game of Thrones offers only a swooping glimpse in the opening credits of season 2. The compendium, The World of Ice and Fire, provides a fuller account, but cautions that what is reported of Sothorios is speculative and fantastical. Its description is a medley of tropes from pre-modern accounts of terra incognita. The continent's dense jungle makes it uninhabitable. It is home to brindled men and perverse fauna, and its abandoned interior city, called Yin, is a black-stoned ruin. The World of Ice and Fire also positions Sothorios as the global south of the known world. Its account refracts this fantastic medieval world through the prism of modern geopolitics, especially the devastating legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. By a logic of parallelism, Sothorios is the series' Africa equivalent, subjected to looting and slaving raids. The opulent civilizations of Essos are built on the forced labor of trafficked Sothoriosan peoples. Yet, as part of the general occlusion of Sothorios in the novels, there is little exploration of this. The large-scale northern theft of southern people is alluded to, but the focus remains on the slavers and the liberators, rather than on the enslaved themselves. Martin has claimed that northern ignorance of Sothorios reflects history, saying that medieval Europe, quote, knew relatively little about sub-Saharan Africa, unquote. We have, however, known for some time about Mediterranean societies' knowledge of Africa, as attested in late medieval cartography. Bearing in mind Martin's wide reading of medieval history, the removal of this knowledge from the known world seems a deliberate narrowing of the compass not just of that world, but of Western knowledge of Africa. This is reinforced by the decision to locate Sothorios below Essos at the southern perimeter of the Summer Sea, altering the map so there is no Africa-like continent south of the quasi-British European Westeros, protects Westeros from an expectation of knowledge about Sothorios and hence from a reckoning with its exploitation. It also precludes the possibility of Sothoriosan exchange with Westeros. And this has particular ramifications for the southern Westerosi kingdom of Dawn, which is the series equivalent to medieval Al-Andalus. Unlike Muslim Spain, which came under the rule of Berber dynasties, Dawn does not enjoy any relationship to any cultures further south. Moving Sothorios east, which is what Martin has done, has the equivalent effect of writing the Berber influence out of the Western world. I begin with Sothorios because it is a revealing example that captures the complexities of what happens when medievalism extends beyond the familiar historical imaginary based on the post-Roman European and British past. On the one hand, Martin's series has expanded beyond the Norse-inflected Anglo-centric focus of the medievalist fantasy genre, creating a sprawling intercontinental realm of warfare, religion, and commerce. On the other hand, his handling of Sothorios exposes the residual ethnocentrism at the heart of the series Medievalism, which ultimately confines the presence of non-Northern actors, focalizes Western perspectives, and protects Western innocence about the exploitation of the global South. In this respect, the series assumes the centrality of a Western worldview despite its expansive scale. Numerous readers, many of those readers of colour, have expressed dissatisfaction with this occlusion of a broader global history in post-Tolkien medievalist fantasy. These include Jamaican-born author Marlon James, whose Dark Star trilogy uses the familiar generic traits of fantasy, but with a new cultural and racial orientation, drawing on the great pre-1500 African civilizations for historical detail and on African epic for fantasy elements. The Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire series has been of keen interest to scholars of the Middle Ages because its imperfect attempt at offering a medievalesque world characterized by transnational exchange and expansion and diasporic communities corresponds with an increasing scholarly interest in exploring the years between 500 and 1500, that is, the time that Western nomenclature calls the Middle Ages, as an epoch of interconnectedness, of exchanges, migrations, and cross-race and interfaith encounters. Within this particular scholarly development, the Middle Ages are now increasingly coming to be understood under the auspices of a deep historical reconceptualization of the global. Of course, this is what this conference is all about. The notion of cultural interconnectedness is a leitmotif running through recent scholarship dedicated to examining the global medieval. So I'm just going to pull up a little list. Oh, sorry. No, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so the notion of cultural interconnectedness is a leitmotif, as I've mentioned, running through the recent scholarship dedicated to examining the global medieval. The North American-based Global Middle Ages Project, which has been running since 2011, states on its website that it aims to, quote, see the world whole in a large swathe of time as a network of spaces braided into relationship by trade and travel, mobile stories, cosmopolitan religions, global cities, cultural borrowings, traveling technologies, international languages, and even pandemics, climate, and war, unquote. In the 2014 inaugural, hang on, I'm just going to put this, I'm putting this list up because it's, you know, it's past 7:30 at night in Brazil, and I figured it would be fair enough for me to put some names up rather than you have to scribble them down. In the 2014 inaugural issue of the Medieval Globe, the editorial statement similarly declares the journal's dedication to the interdisciplinary examination of, quote, varieties of connectivity, communication and exchange, unquote, across the millennium leading up to 1500. Cultural and religious exchange as a symptom of the global features even more explicitly in a 2014 special issue of Literature Compass, where co-editors Geraldine Heng and Lynn Ramey evoke a pre-modern globalism, which they distinguish from globalization as a symptom of late capitalism. The 2015 issue of PMLA, co-edited by Sahara Mayer and Laura Doyle, continues this theme, calling for a longer durée global studies. More recently, in Past and Present, Catherine Holmes and Naomi Standen attribute the marginalization of the Middle Ages to, quote, the still ubiquitous idea that truly global history only began with European long-distance maritime expeditions in the early modern centuries, unquote. This apparently new transnational approach to the Middle Ages is, of course, not new. Scholarship on the Crusades and on medieval Byzantium, for instance, has long focused on East-West exchange and de facto globalism, querying Western triumphalism in the process. The portrayal of cultural complexity in this work has been reinforced by the study of minority races and cultures within the medieval West, such as the Jewish presence throughout Europe and England, and the Western Islamic diaspora in Spain, Sicily, and North Africa. It has, moreover, been 30 years since, before European hegemony, the world system AD 1250 to 1350, Janet Aboulegod's intervention into world systems theory, a field that had hitherto reified an epochal divide brought about by transatlantic expansion. Aboulegod's attention to Islamic trade routes that traversed Western and non-Western spaces in the 12th and 13th century, from Persian to China, Africa, India, and the Indo-Malay region, corresponds to research undertaken outside of medieval studies that has for some time been drawing attention to the interactions of coeval cultures in that period. It's only more recently, however, that the insights of this earlier work have been recognized as foundational to the current refiguring of the Middle Ages as global. The idea of the global Middle Ages has not been unanimously embraced, it should be said. Robert I. Moore, who I had up on a previous slide, is among those who argue against imposing Western periodization on non-European cultures, since the division of history into ancient, medieval, and modern makes little sense, he says, beyond Europe. Moore's point about historical nomenclature reflects long accepted practice among scholars of Asia, Africa, and other areas of non-Eurocentric focus. Indeed, even the most enthusiastic advocates for globalizing the medieval have conceded that the term medieval carries an inescapable Eurocentric charge. Heng and Ramey suggest that the term the Middle Ages can, quote, only be embraced under erasure when applied beyond Europe. I'm assuming most people are familiar with the phrase under erasure. If you're not, it just means you write it, you strike it through, the word is still visible underneath the strike through. So you're using it, but you're using it with a recognition of its imperfection and the limitations of it as a term. So even the most enthusiastic advocates are recognizing that it's a troubling term in a range of ways. So the idea of a global Middle Ages, oh, I've said this, okay. So the power of the phrase, the Middle Ages, to illuminate, yet also to obscure, is registered in the general scholarly reluctance to expanding the term to encompass coeval non-European cultures, for instance, pre-Columbian, the cultures of pre-Columbian America, or to use an example closer to my part of the world, the Tuitonga Empire of Oceania, also say Maori culture, etc., sort of thriving cultures in the period that we call medieval, which don't tend to be named as medieval. This is, of course, partly due to the fact that these cultures have not, or not yet, been found to have participated in the medieval world system, stretching from Western Europe to the Malay Straits, and so are deemed to have operated according to their own unrelated temporalities. Notwithstanding such hesitations and occlusions, which are under constant revision as new intercultural links come to light, the increasing scholarly investment in a globalised Middle Ages is undeniable. Because post-medieval interpretations of the medieval are inseparable from the creative, cultural and ideological uses to which they're put, the concerns of medieval studies and medievalism studies are also inseparable. As mentioned earlier, numerous recent portrayals of a medieval world characterised by cultural diversity and mobility have been presented expressly as correctives to those nationalistic, Eurocentric and racist instrumentalizations which feature a Middle Ages that is a site of ratio-cultural purity. While these recent globalizing representations are intended as urgent interventions in a pernicious political situation, they also take their place within a longer reckoning that has been underway for the last quarter century at least. And here I'm referring to a whole host of scholars who have demonstrated how closely the academic study of the Middle Ages has been imbricated since the 19th century with the nationalistic, nativist and race identitarian politics of Britain and Europe and their former colonies. There has been sustained critical reflection on the legacy that this has bequeathed to modern scholarly and popular perceptions of the Middle Ages, which are readily co-opted into nationalistic, colonialist and racist causes. And so I'm thinking of that great work that was done sort of in, from the 1990s on the history of the discipline and looking at the way in which the scholarship of the field was kind of grounded in things like European nationalism. So recently, a welcome counterpoint to this narrative of exclusion has begun to emerge, alongside the narrative of Euro-triumphalist exclusionary practice. Just to give a couple of examples, Candice Barrington and Jonathan Shu's Global Choices Project is one leading example of work that has sought to demonstrate how medieval insular and European cultural legacies have been adapted by modern cultures around the world for the adapting culture's own purposes. While much has been said about medievalism that responds to globalization by retreating into or aggressively asserting deep national, racial, and religious identities rooted in the medieval period, it is also possible to identify other medievalist formations that attempt to challenge and displace this legacy, adapting the medieval past in ways that reflect post- or anti-colonial and anti-racist priorities. And again, Jonathan Shu's book, I think it might have even come out yesterday, his book on anti-racist medievalisms. Patient Agbabi, in a recent essay on her own 2014 multicultural slam adaptation of Chaucer called Telling Tales, reminds readers that anti-colonial politics can also be found in texts that elect, as hers does, to retain Chaucer's London setting, since the former colonial headquarters has changed profoundly to become the multicultural metropolis that it is today. The growing body of work examining non- or anti-colonial medievalisms produced by and relevant to cultures beyond Europe owes its impetus as much to the disciplines of world history and world literature and post-colonial, transnational and diasporic studies as it does to medieval studies. It's true that the call within those related disciplines to provincialize Europe offers a particular set of challenges to us who are working in a discipline whose very name, medievalism studies, appears to take European geotemporality as its starting point. But it also offers exciting opportunities to medievalism studies precisely because the critical compass of medievalism expands both temporally and geographically far beyond its European point of departure. In historical terms, the notion of global medievalism, unlike the global Middle Ages, is not fraught with the same potential for oxymoron, since an enormous number of medievalist texts, objects, and practices have emerged out of the respective eras of global colonialism, transnational industrialization, global warfare, and neoliberal globalization. So we're kind of much more closely adjacent, as it were, to the global as a discipline than perhaps, say, medieval studies in a sort of in terms of proximity. The medievalisms that I'll be discussing a little later have been produced over the last 20 years or so, and in this respect, they would seem to be located unambiguously within globalized culture. But as I'll go on to discuss, I wish to argue that they are also, indeed more accurately, describable as forms of world medievalism because of their transtemporal content, scope, and practice. So I'll talk a bit now about this idea of world medievalism, and I'll be drawing on ideas from world literature studies in the course of discussing it. So in arguing for world medievalism, I wish to invoke a broad, quite capacious use of the idea of world that does not preclude or disqualify other useful overlapping terms, such as global, transnational, transcultural, diasporic, post-colonial, decolonial. There's a whole cluster of terms that kind of come in, I think, under this idea. But having said that, why then single out the term world medievalism? Why not global? Anyone who's familiar with world literature studies will be aware of that field's ongoing debates around competing nomenclatures in quest of terms that do not reproduce hierarchies that are non-inclusive or reaffirm Euro-Anglo dominance. Scholars have repeatedly signalled the importance of operating with care in relation to the cosmopolitan formulation of world literature inherited from Goethe in his 1827 coining of Weltliteratur, a literature he envisaged as reaching beyond the stultifying strictures of European national traditions. Emily Apter, for instance, who's a critic of the term, points to the necessity of recognising the capacity of the term world literature to flatten out important differences between local literatures. This term, she argues, potentially reinforces centre-periphery hierarchies and overlooks the power differentials between literary cultures bequeathed both by colonial histories and the global capitalist literary market, which leads it to emphasise similarity and to assume translatability between cultures. Peng Chia, on the other hand, argues that the universalism inherited from Goethe has been too readily dismissed, I guess, by Apter and some of her colleagues. Chia claims that a re-examination of this cosmopolitan impulse reveals that it need not be Euro-triumphalist, but can endow world literature with the capacity to reveal universal history across particular differences, even as such differences are valued, as its fictions, that is world literature's fictions, open and make worlds as a way of contesting capitalist globalization. Chia calls for a renewed acknowledgement of world literature's normative ethical project as, quote, a modality of cosmopolitanism that is responsible and responsive to the need to remake the world as a hospitable place, that is, a place that is open to the emergence of peoples that globalization deprives of world, unquote. I believe that at its best, world medievalism can partake of a comparable ethical project, although it too risks reproducing ethnocentric, Eurocentric hierarchies. Chia's argument for world literature as an ethical creative project that actively makes worlds is significant for my account of medievalism as a transhistorical phenomenon. And this is because Chia's argument is buttressed by his call for a renewed attention to what he calls the temporal historical dimension inherent within the idea of world. He queries the tendency, in world literature studies, to perpetuate spatialized conceptualizations that conflate the world with the globe, and hence only understand world literature in terms of, quote, this is a quote from him, in terms of spatial circulation, the paradigmatic case of which is the global capitalist market exchange, unquote. A temporalized conception of world, conversely, perceives it as, quote, an ongoing dynamic process of becoming, something that is continually being made and remade because it possesses a historical temporal dimension, unquote. This perspective makes possible a conceptualization of a world literature, or indeed a world medievalism, that even when participating in modern globalized exchange can also transcend it, that exchange ethically and imaginatively through its engagement with historical change. Debjani Ganguly has also argued against what she sees to be a shallow apprehension of world literature that overemphasizes, quote, its synchronous temporality with global capital, unquote, and ignores what she calls its anarchic temporality. Ganguly, and here I'll just say that it's very interesting that when Ganguly is talking about this idea of the deep temporality of world literature, she actually ends up using a medievalist example, which is Osip Mandelstam's essay, Conversations about Dante. And this was an essay that Mandelstam wrote while he was incarcerated under the Stalinist regime. And he drew on Dante as a kind of an inspiration as a fellow poet. Ganguly argues that the world in world literature refers more to its, quote, unpredictable routes of circulation and its horizon of reception across crisscrossing temporal arcs, unquote. For my purposes, Cheers and Ganguly's emphasis on temporality reveals a key reason why world is a more amenable concept for a cultural phenomenon such as medievalism, with its anarchic temporality. World exceeds the global in its temporal depth and horizon, accommodating an idea of transcultural community that reaches back beyond the period when globe became synonymous with global capitalism. So while my study embraces the general globalist impulse to contest those medievalisms that make nationalist, territorial, political, and racial claims on the Middle Ages, it nevertheless argues for medievalism as a transtemporal world phenomenon. In so doing, I'm trying to address also some other reservations raised by medievalists about the potentially troubling implications of modern portrayals of the Middle Ages as global. And I'm thinking here particularly of Kathleen Davis, who's raised concerns about whether creating a longue durée account of the global, via the Middle Ages, offers a deep historical justification or legitimating past for neoliberal globalization. And the concern raised by Davis is reiterated by Holmes and Standen, who caution against a global Middle Ages being understood as a stage in the relentless development toward modernity's global order. The multi-temporal conceptualization of world as reformulated by Chia and also Ganguly offers greater flexibility for creative post-medieval reimaginings of a connected and decentered medieval world, as it does not inadvertently provide portrayals of the period that naturalize global capitalism. My own approach is aligned with this, aiming to investigate how we might understand the circulation of medieval texts as world phenomena, traversing different times and places, often caught within the circuits of global capitalism, but also sometimes short-circuiting them. I'm also persuaded by the efficacy of the concept of world because of its relationship to the conceptual approach of phenomenology, which introduces an important experiential dimension into thinking about medievalism, rather than seeing it only as a historical and geopolitical phenomenon or as a cultural practice. So I'm really interested in this idea of the experiential nature of medievalism. The advantage of using a phenomenologically derived frame to describe a medievalist epistemology is that it offers a language for discussing the unarticulated knowledges and experiences informing medievalist understandings of the Middle Ages. Its chief strength lies in its querying of empiricism, since empirical knowledge is often not at the heart of medievalist creative practice. Medievalism relies at least as much on hermeneutic and felt understandings of the medieval world as it does on historical knowledge. And I work particularly in creative medievalism, so that partly, my view of it is partly informed by the texts I work on. So, of particular value for creative medievalisms is the replacement within phenomenology of disinterested comprehension with interested apprehension, a term that aptly describes medievalist knowing because it implies receptivity and a grasp that is not fully conceptual, but comprises also cognitive, somatic, and emotionally inflected understanding. This form of understanding is part of the phenomenological experience of being engaged with and dwelling in a world, where world is understood to be a background context of meaning, action, and communication. But how can the medieval world be experienced phenomenologically by us, those who, by dint of time, cannot physically dwell in it? I wish to suggest that the medieval world is best understood as the kind of world described by Martin Heidegger, that is not a neutral world not a neutral world of objects, but rather an apprehended constellation of beliefs, practices, values, and events, what he called a referential context of significance. Christina Lafont argues that Heidegger's idea of world can be applied to entities such as cultures, including past cultures. Notably, for our purposes, she points out that, quote, we refer to cultures as worlds in expressions such as the world of Renaissance man or the medieval world, unquote. Lafont argues that humans can dwell in such culture worlds in, quote, a non-spatial sense of the term, unquote, apprehending these worlds without having any direct physical perception of them. Taking this into account, medievalism can be thought of as a transhistorical experiential state to which, to use Heidegger's term, enables acts of world disclosure in relation to the medieval world, making the possibilities of meaning within this world available to post-medieval people. The effective and encompassing state that facilitates and is achieved through this kind of medievalist world disclosure is what Heidegger calls Stimmung, a musicologically inflected term that is expressive of engaged attunement. Such states of effective attunement open and make accessible meaningful dimensions of a world rather than responding to specific objects, although objects within that world can elicit affective responses that in turn reveal a broader sense of their context. And I'll just give you one example, and this is an old one that I've written about a few years ago, but it's a helpful one for capturing what I'm talking about: heritage tourism sites. And so what I'm saying is that heritage tourism sites do not just recreate the Middle Ages empirically and factually through displaying objects in glass cases with explanatory placards, but through using space evocatively, as well as relying on the transitive senses of hearing and smell to create a powerful sonic and olfactory sense of connection to the medieval past, filling visitors with the presence of the past. And here I've just given the example of the Yorick Viking Centre in York, which is kind of famously immersive and famously kind of world disclosing, and particularly it's particularly famous for how smelly it is. It's quite a smelly place, and that's part of its attempt at sort of this kind of sensual world disclosure. Okay, creative medievalist texts rely on imaginative rather than reconstructed sensory encounters to disclose medieval worlds or to depict characters' encounters with these disclosed worlds. To do this, they both draw on and add to their readers' attunement to the Middle Ages. A consideration of medievalist Stimmung does not preclude an acknowledgement of more determinate intellectual or conceptual interactions, such as, for instance, reading and analysing medieval texts or dating artefacts, nor does it deny the very specific joys and frustrations that that kind of scholarly activity might elicit. Importantly, Stimmung does not conjure away the ideological underpinnings of post-medieval attitudes toward the medieval. Rather, it claims that these are always suffused with and sometimes even exceeded by an experience of transhistorical attunement. As my opening example of Game of Thrones demonstrates, creative evocations of medieval pasts are acts of world disclosure, or to use another Heideggerian term, worlding, that either invite audiences into immersive experiences of those pasts, or at the very least explore the capacity of the medieval world to offer such transhistorical experiences. But as my discussion of the limitations of Martin's world also reveals, the experience need not prevent us from measuring the cultural and ideological implications of the medieval worlds that medievalism discloses. especially when those worlds are expanded culturally and geopolitically beyond Europe. A theory of phenomenological medievalism can recognize the proliferation of medieval worlds in reception, but adds to this a powerful recognition of the affective experience, so the emotional and embodied experience involved in and even motivating medievalism's worlding of the Middle Ages. So that's the theory bit done. You'd be happy to know. And I'm going to go on now to talk about just some of the key examples of world medievalism that are in the book that will be coming out soon, and sort of just talking a little bit about, I suppose, giving them as examples of some of the ways we can think through this idea of world medievalism. So one question that kind of came to me and I think concerns us all as people trying to think through what this, whether we call it global or whether we call it world medievalism, what it can mean. One question is how to handle cultural and geographical coverage when it comes to producing world-spanning accounts. Tracing worldwide trajectories of medieval culture proceeds rather by, and medievalist culture, of course, proceeds rather by an uneven accrual of multiple accounts of localities beyond the Eurosphere as well as within it. And any attempt to account for large-scale historical formations must accommodate, and this is, I think, really important, how local and regional histories intersect with or depart from those, again, those larger formulations. The medieval globe and the medievalist globe will not have an even or seamless surface. And so in accordance with that, the four examples that I'm going to be looking at of world medievalism are far from exhaustive of this worldwide phenomenon, although two of them cover distant points of the Northern Hemisphere and two are from the global South. I've rather aimed to feature examples of this sort of the basis of selection. I've aimed rather to feature examples that are reflective of four very specific sets of historico-cultural and geopolitical conditions, but are also reflective of larger trends in how concepts of the medieval have been taken up across the world. The principle shaping my use of these examples is chiefly heuristic. That is, they exemplify possible approaches to thinking through medievalism as a world phenomenon, with each case reflecting a disposition toward worldliness and a specific medievalist world disclosure that is closely reflective of its geocultural location, but isn't necessarily reducible to it. So each example basically is about a different approach, a different place, a different way of thinking through this question. So part of the story I tell is that of medievalism as a symptom of or a justification for conquest, exclusion, and domestication. But the other part of the story is different and reveals how, as medievalism travels away from the centre, it follows unpredictable paths and makes surprising conjunctions. It shows how, in environments beyond Europe, medievalist world disclosure heralds resistance and appeals for justice and inclusion, and how its pre-modern strangeness makes it an unexpected portal into the deep time of peoples who predate even the thought of Europe. So I'll move to my first example now, and this is one, it might seem surprising to put this in the context of world medievalism, but I'll talk about why it is. Okay, so because I, as I said before, I'm trying to think about this idea of world quite capaciously and trying to think about it in a way where it doesn't have to preclude or exclude ideas of talking about the global and globalization, but tries to also bring that conversation about globalization into, I suppose, into contact with ideas about trans-historical cultural contact. So that's kind of where my head's at in thinking about this stuff. So first up, I examine the valency. Sorry, just before I dive in, just to say I can't go into much depth about these examples. I'm just kind of giving you a little snapshot of them. They're obviously spoken about at much greater length throughout the book, but just to give you a sense of how I'm kind of jumping around. So I examine the valency of the Middle Ages as a period in the recent French political imaginary and its recent vocabularies of nationhood, tracing how European nationalist medievalisms of recent decades can be read as a response to the perceived threats and uncertainties of globalization, in particular, the threat of the so-called Great Replacement, which is preached by the right-wing thinker Renaud Camus, in which the flow of Islamic migrants from the East and North Africa will replace France's deep-rooted French population. Although a number of French political commentators have viewed the later Middle Ages as the truest expression of French greatness, for others, the Middle Ages is the period that sowed the seeds for a cultural and political decline in France that continues today. The most prominent and controversial recent instance of this has emerged in the writings of the French new reactionaries, including in particular Éric Zemmour in his book Mélancolie Française, and it's a fascinating and horrifying book. So in the chapter, I examine Zemmour's ideological use of the Middle Ages to account for what he regards as the rise of French cultural malaise and the loss of identity in the era of multiculturalism and globalized economy. And what I also do is analyze some debates that emerged in the French public sphere before and after Zemmour, including in 3 recent high-profile French novels that can be regarded as vehicles for 3 very different medievalist explorations of contemporary French identity. All 3 of these novels are by basically authors who have won the Prix Goncourt, the kind of most prestigious literary prize in France. And so they've all been kind of quite widely known novels that I'm talking about here. So the first of these is Jerome Ferrari's 2012 novel, Sermon on the Fall of Rome, which offers a searching exploration of the perception of France's past as a post-Roman vacuum, as a way of reckoning with the geopolitical and emotional fallout of France's loss of its modern colonial empire. So it kind of wraps in the kind of the Algerian, the kind of period post the Algerian Wars, with this kind of meditation on Augustine's sermons. I trace how the novel draws a parallel between the present and the early medieval period via an invocation of the sermons delivered by St. Augustine in the wake of Rome's fall, which converge with the novel's meditation on the futility of empire building as a human endeavor. I then explore the notorious uptake of the idea of French decline and the Great Replacement of French people by Muslims in Michel Houellebecq's 2015 novel Submission or Soumission. I argue that Houellebecq's satiric portrait of France's transformation into an Islamic-ruled polity is presented as the harnessing of France's medieval religious and sexist impulses, which have only been superficially suppressed in modernity. And finally, I examine how Matthias Enard's 2015 novel Compass makes use of medieval literary and historical legacies to expose the complexities of the West's rapprochement with the East in the 21st century. It's a massive novel, but a really, really interesting one. And the novel grapples with the cosmopolitan desire to emphasize cross-cultural empathy between East and West in order to combat Islamophobia. But the novel also grapples with the need to recognize the unequal power dynamics underpinning Orientalism and the need to recognize and to acknowledge Europe's implication in the legacies of colonialism, and again, particularly colonialism in the East, neo-colonialism. Examining these texts together enables a nuanced account of how France in the age of globalization has used the Middle Ages to understand its own long, contradictory love affair with ideas of nation, empire, and world. And the last text that I've just got up there, I do actually discuss this one as well. And this is a large history volume that came out in the last few years called Histoire mondiale de France. And it's a really interesting attempt to reconfigure French history in terms of large global change and kind of deep global change too. So it sort of starts with, kind of Neolithic culture and then sort of moves forward. So it's a really fascinating book that sort of history book that sort of frames some of these other and responds to some of these other trends. So that's my first example I'll give to you. So I'll move on to my second one. Okay, so next I examine the staging of interfaith encounter and conflict in the Islam Quintet, a suite of historical novels written between 1992 and 2010 by the British Pakistani author, activist and commentator Tariq Ali. And what I was sort of looking at in this chapter, I'll try to sort of summarize very quickly, but I was interested in the way Ali uses these novels, in particular as a way to respond to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis. And this is something that Ali had also done in non-fiction book, the non-fiction book, The Clash of Fundamentalisms. But these novels are very clearly also part of that attempt on his part to respond to this thesis of inter-civilizational conflict. And he's particularly, in the case of his medievalism, he's responding to Huntington and this thesis in the three novels that are set in the medieval Islamicate world. And these are contexts that are shaped by interfaith and intercultural connections. The three novels are out of the quintet that are set in the Middle Ages are The Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, set in 15th century Al-Andalus, A Sultan in Palermo, set in 12th century Sicily, and the Book of Saladin, set in Crusade era Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. These books are written to correct Eurocentric occlusions of the Arab contribution to global knowledge, as well as to correct misperceptions of Islam as a static culture of fanaticism. So the novels offer Ali a creative way of meditating on, and also offer Ali a creative way of meditating on contemporary East-West geopolitics. And so the first novel is responding to the First Gulf War. So that's Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree. Sultan in Palermo is responding to basically the US occupation of the Middle East in the Second Gulf War. And the Book of Saladin is responding to Israel-Palestine tensions, etc. So they're all kind of tied in with these contemporary issues. So I argue that through their imaginative narration of a longer history of cross-cultural encounter and conflict in the medieval Islamic diaspora, the novels develop a central unstable tension between conviventia, and that's an idea, conviventia, we know it's a contested term, but it's one that Ali completely buys into for these novels, so I'll just say that. The novels develop a central unstable tension between conviventia, an ideal polity built on interfaith cohabitation achieved under Arab governance, and occupation, a hostile monocultural regime imposed under Christian rule. My account of these novels places them in the longer context of the Arab historical novel over the past century or so, considering the vital role of this genre in forging a fictional historicist response to the Western presence in the Middle East and its promotion of a nationalist and pan-Arabist perspectives. And as a precedent to Ali, in the book I single out Georgie Zaidan, the prolific Cairo-based Lebanese Egyptian public intellectual and historical novelist. And what I do in that chapter is examine Zaidan in the context of the lively Middle Eastern cultural scene of the Arab Nahda, or awakening, in which early Arabic texts and languages were recovered as part of a complex attempt to define modern Arab cultural identity and also nationhood in this kind of pan-Arabist framework. So this discussion does not seek to recuperate the Islamic world into Western chronologies. Rather, it complicates Western understandings of the medieval by exploring how these texts highlight the linked destinies of Western and Islamic societies. Its account demonstrates that the Islamic world, like the West, has felt an attraction and a repulsion to the medieval past since the late 19th century, reclaiming this period as a cultural golden age, but also as a time of East-West encounters and of critical reflections and multiple truths. So those are the kind of two Northern Hemisphere texts, and I'll move on to my Southern Hemisphere ones before I finish up. So moving to the study of the Southern Hemisphere, and you're thinking, what on earth is on that screen right now? I'll explain. So moving to the Southern Hemisphere brings us to a cultural, religious, linguistic, and scientific crossroads. And so my next example takes as its focus the collapsing of fantastic medievalism, so fantasy-derived medievalism, and paleontology in the scientific and media narratives surrounding the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the petite, large-footed hominid species which has gone informally by the name of the Hobbit since its remains were uncovered on the island of Flores in 2003. So I explore the convergence of two aspects of world medievalism by analysing how the discovery of the Asian hominid came to be seen through the prism of the globally exported medievalist fantasy of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth novels and their film adaptations. I argue that although the medievalizing of this hominid might be seen simply as a convenient analogy because it was found, right when the first when Peter Jackson's films were coming out. So, it might just, it could be just a coincidence, but rather than saying it's a coincidence or simply a convenient analogy, in fact, I argue the relationship is closer. For just as Tolkien's multi-species Middle-earth explores the moral contours of humanity, so too the scientific debates that were waged over Homo floresiensis trace the biological, anthropological, and historical parameters of the human species across its global migrations. I explore in the chapter, I explore the evidence of this medievalizing in a whole range of different texts in archaeologists' memoirs. So this, I guess what I'm saying is this uptake of the idea of this particular hominid as an Asian hobbit it was really across the board, and there was lots and lots and lots of stuff that I could look at to explore what this was about. So some of the things that I'm looking at are archaeologists' memoirs, scientific and media reporting, films, and that includes the Peter Jackson films, but also Asian fantasy films that are based on the Flores discovery. You can see Lord of the Elves there, and Southeast Asian folklore, and of course the fossil finds themselves from the Flores excavations. The medievalizing of the Flores hominid exposes the potency of the medieval for the popular understanding of the deep historical past. The remarkable scientific saga of the Flores hobbit reveals the capacity for the medieval to come to stand in not just for the global human history writ large, but for the way we figure and understand deep time and the primeval past. I also examine the difficult racial politics underlying this episode. I argue that the framing of Homo floresiensis within Tolkien-influenced medievalism ultimately constructs a limiting image of globally conceived humanity, overwriting the hominid's femaleness, Austronesian identity, and Paleolithic age, with this, at the same time as confirming genre fantasy fiction's staple image of the medieval past as white, male, and European. And this example serves as a reminder that world medievalism has the potential to reinforce rather than to unsettle the Eurocentric legacy of the Middle Ages in the modern world. So that's my first Southern Hemisphere example, and I'll just quickly pop over to my final my second Southern Hemisphere example. And this was a really tricky one for me to talk about. I've actually been looking at this example for a long time, for about 10 years, and it's just in the past 2 years that I've had help from colleagues in Indigenous studies who've really helped guide me through how to understand this film and recognise the way its Indigenous ideas about the past are in dialogue with Western ideas about what we take to be a deep past. So moving on then, I examine in this part of the book an Australian Indigenous interpretation of a period that is apparently coeval with the European Middle Ages as it unfolded in the north of the Australian continent. Research into Australian medievalisms, including my own research over many years, have tended to focus on white settler perceptions and reconstructions of the Middle Ages, a very much kind of colonial perspective on the Middle Ages. This investigation will take a different approach, examining what might constitute a decolonial Australian medievalism by looking at the 2006 film 10 Canoes, a joint Indigenous and non-Indigenous production by Rolf de Heer, Peter Jagir, and the Yolngu people. So the Yolngu people are Indigenous people of Eastern Arnhem Land, which sets its story, so that the film sets its story in the Yolngu territories of Arnhem Land, apparently 1,000 years ago. So kind of in some Middle Ages, some kind of Middle Ages. This film's communication of deep Yolngu history to a general audience. So it's there are different versions of the film, but the kind of popular release version of the film has English subtitles. It's in Yolngu Mata, the Yolngu language, but it's got English subtitles. So the film's communication of a deep Yolngu history to a general audience is, I argue, part of a broader historical project. For just as recent work on the global Middle Ages emphasises international networks of cultural, economic, linguistic and material exchange as an alternative to narratives of Western dominance, so too, research into Indigenous Australian history prior to colonisation is giving increased attention to its long social, trade and even religious networks with other non-European societies. And there's been a lot of fantastic work that's been done on the contact between, particularly again, the Yolngu people and the Macassan people of, the Indo-Malay region, but also, as you can see from the coins there on the right side of the screen, there's, there've been these fascinating finds of things like, East African Islamic coins, or coins from, that have turned up on islands north of Arnhem Land. And so there is this kind of increasing sense of a picture of cultural contact between Northern Indigenous people and people in this apparent medieval world system. So, okay, so in order to convey fully the ideological significance of the film's medievalisation of Yolngu culture, I give a contextual account of how white settler culture has long relegated Australian Indigenous culture to a timeless place outside of history. So the film's kind of reinsertion of this culture back into some idea of time intelligible to Western ideas of time is significant. This film's creation of a non-European medieval past for the Yolngu is, as I discuss, a highly sophisticated instance of a non-European Indigenous culture recreating a deep past. So exploring how the film represents its ancestral memory of the Yolngu world 1,000 years ago, I argue that a properly worldly approach to medievalism needs to take into account how the period known in the West as the Middle Ages has figured for cultures whose contact with colonialism has left them negotiating between European and non-European ideas of time and the distant past. I argue finally that a discussion of this film demands that the concept of world be replaced by the Australian Aboriginal concept of country, which expresses a deeply intertwined phenomenological relationship between the human and the more than human world. This final example demonstrates the extent to which the very idea of the medieval world can be queried and even displaced from outside Europe. So, this is me concluding now, you'll be relieved to know, with their persistent return to the specificities of place, these examples remind us that world, phenomenologically conceived, is finally a concept that has a deeper materiality to it than arguably than the idea of the global. As such, world touches on the planetary because its southern medievalisms raise questions about how ideas of the medieval relate to the planet, how they interpret and occlude the environment, how they provide ways of understanding and misunderstanding time, and the deep temporality of human habitation and the strata of the earth itself. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Okay. So, thank you, Louise. That was quite fascinating, to be honest. And I think it was the perfect closure for this conference, in which many of those topics and references were mentioned. So, yeah.
I wish I hadn't been asleep through it. Sorry, I was sleeping through so much of your conference. Just, that's not because I wanted to.
It's on YouTube.
So I'm sorry if I overlapped with people's ideas too much, but yeah.
No, I don't think. I think actually it is, wow, a quite thorough perspective on what many people said, and with baffling theoretical aspects. I mean, I'm still trying to figure what is the being in Heidegger's Scene and Time in English. I mean, I have this book here somewhere, and I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what he meant, and it's amazing to see it used so well. Well, but enough of that. I think Vinicius wants to have some words, and then we can open.
Okay.
To questions.
Thank you, Louise. Amazing talk, as always. It's a pleasure to have you back with us. And I really was surprised when I saw the last number of Studies in Medievalism with your article about the Sultan in Palermo, one of my favorite books. Well, and I'm really intrigued by contemporary Islamic medievalisms. Now, I've been researching about political medievalisms of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, about Saladin, and Iranian about Imam Hussein. Well, and I have some doubts about the adequacy of speaking about medievalism in Islamic world. It's a conflict. If we're doing a good job talking about it, or we are colonizing that imaginary too.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, I think in some ways, and I do raise that. I mean, these are sorts of things that I felt like I raised that once, maybe twice in this talk, but it's obviously a much more abiding concern that I've been able to talk about in this particular talk today. I think Tariq Ali made it a little bit easy for me to use, easier for me to use than the examples you're talking about. In fact, I think because the thing about Tariq Ali is, of course, he's British Pakistani. He is very much he engages very strongly with critiques of Western neo-colonialism. He is part of many kind of Western-based conversations, and the novels that he chooses are all novels of that basically explore East-West contact. So in some ways, I think that he was easier for me to write about for that reason. When I mentioned Georgie Zaidan before, the couple of novels of Georgie Zaidan's that I talk probably most about are ones that are things like Crusades based, so again, there's East-West contact. But lots and lots of his novels are set in that time frame that we call that we in the West call the medieval, but actually have almost no mention whatsoever of what's happening outside the Arab Peninsula or outside of the Eastern world more broadly, and so they become much trickier to discuss in that way. I think that I feel more comfortable talking about it when I'm looking at novels that might be coming out of that sort of non-Western perspective, although in Tariq Ali's case it's always that's not straightforward. But I feel more comfortable when I'm talking about those ones because they're about that contact between East and West. But I agree with you. I think that the terminology gets harder to apply and potentially more colonizing. I agree with you. I talk about that quite a lot in the book, and again, didn't sort of say too much here today, but I agree with you that we have to be constantly monitoring that potential. And when I look at the 10 Canoes example in the book, I talk about that quite extensively because I think that in the end, 10 Canoes makes it impossible.
Yeah.
Like I start by kind of the premise of what it means to call it medieval, medievalist. And by the end, what that example shows is we just need to keep our hands off some texts and we need to recognize that even when they say 1,000 years ago, we have to back away. So I talk about it in order to show how we kind of in the end can't, if that makes sense.
That makes. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're open for questions, comments, and well, any sort of contribution from the audience. So if you have a question, comment, or anything, please raise your hand on Zoom or do type it in the chat. Since this is our final keynote, we do encourage people to talk instead of typing, if possible. This is a
so I'm just looking at the comments. They're making me laugh. That's for Mike Evans and his old friend Mansa Musa. So I can't believe your stamina that you're all still going at this time of night. But if you have any questions, that's great.
Okay, so questions, comments? I do have a question, but since I'm moderating, I'm waiting for someone else to do it first. Okay, we do have one there. Danny, do you want to ask the question directly? I will.
Thank you for the Bauer reference, by the way. Sorry, I'm just saying somebody just put up the Thomas Bauer reference. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I wanted to ask her if she wanted to talk, but she apparently not.
Thank you. That's Danielle, is it? Yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay, so, well, I'm going to start then, and I think this is an impossible question somehow, but and you kind of answered it already during your talk, but this is something that appeared during many of our panels, especially the one on theory, teaching, and I forgot the other word, but also on the political medievalism ones. And I think and this also goes back to Richard's opening keynote. And I think the question is, so speaking now from the Southern Hemisphere here, at least geographically, if not politically, does the South needs a Middle Ages? Do we need the Middle Ages, our Middle Ages?
So can you say a little bit more? Would you mind just, what do you mean by, what are you thinking when you say need? Do we need it?
Because we discussed a lot the entire idea about global medievalism and the global Middle Ages, and how we learn each day more and more about how everything was probably connected, and how Europe, although the center of this canonical Middle Ages, could also be periphery in other perspectives and for other connected words. So my question is about the terminology Middle Ages. When speaking about Brazil, for example, or Australia, in your case, do we need medieval Australia? And how does that work when talking about periodization, when not only teaching our own, but speaking to our internal audience? Because one thing, it's very easy to say like, oh, yeah, medieval Brazil was Brazil during the same time as the Middle Ages. But was it really?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the answer is, it depends on sort of how we need it. I suppose in some respects, I mean, I'll go back to, I suppose, that idea about, the Middle Ages or the medieval under erasure, that term, that idea that was used by Geraldine Heng and Lynn Ramey. And I've been thinking about it a little bit also in relation to Southeast Asia, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But I think we might not need it much longer. At the moment, I think it's a term that's been used in a particular way to designate a particular kind of period, particular number of years, a particular range of years. And it's, you know, it's been kind of framed not just by Europe. I mean, it's like a Roman time frame. You know, I think somebody once quite perceptively said to me, they think one of the reasons why fantasy ends up working so much up in kind of Nordic sort of, oh, sorry, 1 second. My computer has just unplugged itself. That's okay. Sorry, I'm back. So, you know, that fantasy fiction tries to get itself out of that sort of Roman millennium, you know, it's kind of 5 to 1500 millennium. And the sort of the Norse world makes that possible. So it's a very confined, it's not even a kind of, it's such a confined periodization that I think even applying it inside other parts of Europe gets harder and harder to do. So I think in some ways it's a term that offers a certain kind of historical intelligibility right now. But, you know, whether all of the work that we're doing here means that can continue is an open question. I mean, coming back to what I was going to say before, is that I'm just doing a small project. It's just a little bit of a pilot one at the moment with some other people, looking at particularly Asia Pacific, but Asian medievalisms again. And some of those do work as medievalisms, right? So what I would want to say is when you've got, for instance, if you're looking at a place like Macau and you've got sort of Portuguese, you know, inspired buildings or cuisine or what have you, or you say, let's say particularly Portuguese inspired cathedrals or something like that in a place like Macau, then that's a medievalism insofar as it actually does speak to an idea of the Middle Ages. So there are medievalisms within non-Western spaces that are specifically alluding to the European Middle Ages. And so those are usually kind of, you know, the fruits of colonialism. But I think in other cases, it's not the right word. And the example that I was going to use is the thing that I'm sort of working on right now, very slowly, and because I'm feeling very badly out of my depth as usual, is I'm looking at a series of exhibitions over the last sort of decade or so at the Museum for Asian Civilizations in Singapore. And the reason I chose that is because it's in English. So that's an Asian place I can manage because it's got a lot of English language stuff. And one of the things that's been really, really interesting about looking at those particular exhibitions is that on the one hand, they very much frame themselves in terms of this idea of a kind of a global medieval where, you know, there's contact with the West, et cetera, and they also use Western timelines rather than say necessarily, if they use dynastic timelines like Eastern or Asian dynastic timelines, they also use Western timelines. But they actually then beyond that don't use any Western concepts or Western periodization at all. Once they, you know, all the rest of it then is kind of not alluding at all to Western, you know, the way we would divide up Western, you know, medieval or early modern or ancient, what have you. And so, you know, it just seems as though it's just not even a question. So, you know, if we're going to be working outside of European context, and we have to be ready to drop our time, you know, our time frames, and out of respect for the cultures that we're working on, recognize that then it's going to be redundant sometimes. I guess that's where my thinking's at now. What did people say over the past few days about that?
Oh, many things. I couldn't summarize it, even if I wanted. But we've seen a lot of perspectives. But I think the main idea for the entire conference was okay. We may use Middle Ages medievalism, but it is time to start looking things from another perspective. We need to reframe these categories if we want to keep using them here. I won't. That's my reading of the content of the conference. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that we it's always easy when there are forms of medievalism that come back to Europe, and I think we still need it for that. We definitely still need it for those forms of medievalism. But yeah, I do think that it's becoming harder and harder to do it without feeling like we're just engaged in forms of domestication. You know, what that then means for us and what it is we're actually doing is another thing. Whether in 10 years we can even call it medievalism will be an open question. So I guess I do talk about that on and off throughout the book. I think in the example of the Flores hominid that I talked about before, the medieval just becomes or the idea of a kind of a fantasy medieval just becomes a kind of it just feels increasingly sort of violent throughout that narrative. Increasingly, violent might be too strong, but just increasingly domesticating and increasingly negating might be better. So that's an example of where you really just see, as I was mentioning before, a total overwriting of the specificity of this particular find and what it means for human history, and a kind of a really significant colonization that is not just the colonization of medievalism, but the colonization of the kind of the whole medievalist cinematic apparatus that came with Peter Jackson's films. And so, you know, to me, by the end of it, I sort of started, when I first found out about this, I was working at University of Wollongong, which was the Australian members of the archaeological team that found these bones of the Flores hominid were at my university. And so every time I'd open up my computer, I'd see The Hobbit, you know, and I think, what's this? What on earth's going on here? So I was kind of intrigued and sort of delighted at the beginning. And by the end of it, it just felt so, you know, like such a kind of attempt to reconfigure this really significant find in terms of a sort of a Western cultural imaginary, and an attempt to domesticate time, deep time, in terms of the medieval. So I think you know, part of, I suppose, what we're doing here is, if we use this term, we have to kind of recognize the kind of the difficulties and again, I don't know if violence is too strong a word, but certainly there's the kind of aggression that can be involved in using it.
Thank you. We have a question. I will pass the word to Lucas, but I would also love to hear the input of our colleagues here from the United States and other places. If they have any thoughts on this to share, that will be delightful. Lucas, with you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Lucas.
So with all of what is going on, I was thinking actually of a paper. I just helped a student write her final paper for her undergraduate history course. And she was not dealing with medievalism. She was working with Japanese comics of this so-called One Piece, which is a huge thing all around the world. And she was thinking about the Western characters that flows into this Japanese comics, because it's something about piracy, and they put, and the author, he inserts typical Western pirates in his narrative, like Blackbeard and those pirates from the so-called classic piracy period, Caribbean piracy. So we were actually thinking about what that means, and I proposed her to think the situation in a twofold, because we used to look at this kind of situation thinking, well, there is some kind of colonialism. This author is inserting this kind of characters in his books and his comics because Japan has had a trauma, has been kind of colonized and patronized by the US for so long, and he is trying to incorporate a Western culture into his comics, and I was trying to go the other way around, and thinking what to incorporate these characters. What did that mean for this author, and to try to invert a little bit this idea of colonialism as an kind of imperialistic Western civilization and culture over all other civilizations and all other cultures, and how this author actually he subverts the idea of Western civilization by incorporating it in his mangas. So I was thinking, when we go out into this world medievalism, could we also think of it as some kind of strategy of subverting traditional medievalisms and kind of getting a little bit of a vengeance over Western civilization and the idea that they are better in everything? And I would like to hear more about something in this direction.
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and I think that one of the things I suppose I first of all, as I mentioned along the way there before, that Jonathan Shu's got this book coming out called Anti-Racist Medievalism, so I think maybe is out as of yesterday. So, and it seems he's looking at that kind of thing and looking at Black authors and Latinx artists and people like that. Look, I agree with what you're saying, and I think that it's really important that on the one hand, we absolutely do have to be very, very attentive, and I think people have done, I think Amy Kaufman's here, like people have done fantastic work on looking at all of those very disturbing kind of colonizing or racializing ideas of the Middle Ages. But I think that we also do need to be attentive to instances where we see them of that kind of, as you say, that subversive uptake. When you were talking about the pirates, I had a similar reaction to you, that I was thinking, well, this depends on it depends on the kind of origin of the text. It depends on what the author is, or the creator is doing with that Western presence in the text. And the example that I'll use, if I can come back to 10 Canoes, which is it's a really, really hard text for me to get my head around, because I know, Indigenous texts, Australian texts are always have several layers of knowledge in them. And so I know that there are all sorts of knowledges that are in that film that I can't access, and I'm not actually meant to access, and I'm not allowed to access. And so, but from what I can see in the text, there's very clear and very clever things, like, for instance, the text starts with, once upon a time in a land far, far away. So the narrative actually begins with a classic sort of fairy tale medievalist trope. And then the author actually the narrator then just breaks into laughter after he starts saying that. And then he goes, no, this is my story. It's not your story. And so he actually really playfully takes that trope up and sort of interrupts it. And so on the one hand, yes, of course, we can see in that a kind of a response to Western storytelling, etc. But it's also quite playful. It's using it in a way that isn't. It's not a text that's produced from outside that's kind of imposing this. It's these Indigenous, the Indigenous script writing, etc., that has actually taken that up and pushed back and playfully subverted that kind of Western storytelling mode, because the film then does really kind of quite arresting things with storytelling that are very different from, a straight fairy tale story. So no, I agree with you. I think that we need to keep that emancipatory and subversive potential in there. I think one of the kind of things we have to just watch, I think, around medievalism is, on the one hand, as I say, it's important for us to recognise that long history of the relationship to nationalism or certain forms of regionalism that have a kind of a race inflection. But I think that we, and again, I talk about this a bit in the book, we have to be careful around what I call genetic fallacy. You know, the idea that because the discipline sort of started there, we can never ever kind of shake that legacy and never ever you know, find more positive ways to engage. That legacy is vital to be acknowledged, but I think we also can look for those more sort of subversive articulations and celebrate them when we find them, right? So that we're not just always retelling that same story. It's a really important story, but it's good to have other engagements with that sort of subversive potential. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes.
And Louise is right, I don't bite much.
Yeah,
people are probably really tired, you know, and the poor things I was thinking about the cruelty of talking about Heidegger, who, you know, every time I read any of it, it falls apart in front of my eyes and I have to spend a lot of time figuring out if I've actually understood it. Luckily, I'm married to a philosopher.
Oh.
So who
That
has
helps.
worked quite a bit on Heidegger. So I do run my ideas past somebody who will certainly have no hesitation pulling them down if they're wrong. But it's, yeah, I felt it was a little bit cruel of me to, to bring this stuff up to people who've been conferencing all day and who probably just want to get, you know, get to their wine, you know, their drinks cabinets.
However, it's a good strategy. You beat them.
Yeah, you'll be ready to drink. You'll be ready for a drink.
Okay, Carolina raised her hand. Carol, I'm gonna put you here. Carol, you can talk, I guess.
Oh no, she just said no. That's okay.
No.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
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 Thank you. Now it's working. Thank you so much. I'm still taking in a lot of this information, so I'd like to go a little bit into the Heidegger issue. I have zero deep knowledge of Heidegger, but I would like to know if you could talk a little bit more about how you are connecting, because you mentioned that this phenomenological approach does not exclude the cultural and political aspects of looking at this world medievalism. So if you could maybe talk a little bit more about how these different aspects interconnect.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm thinking about with this is the idea that, if I could just sort of step back to my original kind of interest in this and then sort of see if I can build up to answering your question. So I guess one of the things I've been interested in is, on the one hand, obviously I work a lot on ideologies and politics of medievalism, etc. But some part of me also feels like we need to have a fuller sense of what makes people feel connected to the period. And we need to have some kind of account, if we can, or accounts, can be certainly many accounts other than mine, accounts of the attraction to the Middle Ages or to particular medieval objects or medieval events or people, what have you. And so I guess I've been interested in trying to think about how affect, how feeling, how how perception, how embodied responses are part of the kind of experiential kind of knowledge and attunement, again that word attunement, to the period, and how that is informed by ideology. So, but maybe I guess I'm trying to find a way to say maybe it's not reducible to that, or that the way we experience it doesn't necessarily have ideology at the forefront all the time. And to use, if I can use an autobiographical example, so, I have been asked throughout my life, as I'm sure probably, people who are from Brazil, etc., why are you interested in the Middle Ages? As an Australian, what possible interest can you have in the period? And, there's an ideological and historical answer to that, which is that I am a white settler Australian from a European background who has gone through a Western education system, etc. Right? So that is all true. It's all true. But I'm not sure it completely accounts for my attraction to the period. It certainly frames it. It's certainly taken me toward it. But I guess that sense of attunement and that sense of the appeal of the period connects to my political commitments as a person, my ideological, historical background and placement. But I don't think it necessarily then accounts for straightforwardly for the emotional and cognitive attraction that I experienced toward the period. And I've been thinking about this a little bit. So I guess I've been trying to find a language that can bridge and acknowledge ideology, but also recognize that experiential interest in the Middle Ages. And it's thinking about Tariq Ali, for instance. So when I was talking before about him, again, I'm sort of poaching from the book here, but I talk a bit about how, so first of all, the story that he tells around writing the Islam Quintet is that, okay, so he's listening to the radio, watching the TV, and he hears somebody say something incredibly reductive about Arabic culture being kind of, frozen in time, undeveloped, fanatical, etc. And he has a pretty strong reaction to that, a negative reaction to that, and starts to think, I want to rebut that assumption, which I think is kind of Eurocentric, neo-colonial, etc. So he has a kind of a political response to that moment, but he also has a strongly emotional response to it. He's offended by that comment as a member of, well, he's not Arabic, but a member of the Islamic world. He's also not religious, but he identifies as part of that larger world. So he has that reaction. So his response to that is that because of the connections he has, he's in touch with the BBC, and he's going to do a TV series where he goes to visit various parts of the Islamic world, and he goes the Islamic West in particular. And he goes to, I can't remember if it was Sicily or Al-Andalus that he goes to, and he just has this incredible response to being in situ in those places. And, he's Pakistani, he's Urdu speaking, he's not, Arabic speaking, he's not a practicing Muslim, but he has this very powerful sense of historical relationship to the place. And the way he wants to respond to that is to write a novel. And that novel, by his account, is that he wants to recreate these spaces. He wants to create an immersive experience for his readers of this space as a response to a political comment that he heard. So to me, I was kind of like, so what is that as a phenomenon? Like, how do we talk about that? And because I feel that politics, giving a political and an ideological framing, takes us to a certain point, but doesn't take us all the way. So sorry for such a long answer, but just, I guess, trying to just find a way to bring together a way to talk about embodied and emotional knowledges at the same time as talking about politics. So that's what drew me to using that particular framework. I'm sure it's got problems as a framework, but it answers some questions for me.
I think that was wonderful, very enlightening. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right. Questions, comments, people?
I was thinking here, but on other hand, we have in 16th century, for example, a construction of a global network, we could say that. And another project I'm working with, made by Jesuits, with reliques of the 11,000 virgins and Saint Ursula from Cologne. They spread it in Brazil, 7 skulls, if I can remember well, and that network linked Cologne, the Iberian Peninsula, Brazil, Mozambique, India, even Japan. It's a construct of medievalist kind with the faith in those relics. In that, we have simultaneously to work with a modern construction, contemporary construction, and deconstruction of this kind of, how can I say that, a complex. But in the same time, we need to work with the formation of these constructions. And it's kind of mind-blowing. Wow. To see that resignification of those bones to Native American cultures, to African cultures, to Indian culture, to Japanese culture, to Malayan culture. In that network, oh, I've forgotten, the Iberian culture. Those saints are originally from Germany. And they became patronesses of worldwide reach in a global net of a medievalist construction. And I'm really puzzled. How can I work with that? It's kind of a plea for help.
Oh, from me? I don't know if I'll be able to help.
I need counseling.
So what part of it is puzzling you the most?
Well, how to theorize that construction. Well, when we all are working with deconstruct those complexes.
Well, I mean, what I probably should say is that anything I've said today works for the examples that I've used. You know, it's not to say that that's going to apply all round to every single instance of kind of global medievalism. As I say, it's really just, I suppose it's just because I have been interested in quite a long time in accounting for, pardon me, for what makes people reach for that particular period. You know, the medieval, in the case of the examples that I'm looking at, like there's how it signifies, there's what it means culturally, politically, but I guess also, you know, that kind of sense of how, what other sorts of knowledges do people bring to it? And it's going to apply. I mean, I tend to look in many cases at creative texts, and it might be that it's easier to use something like that sort of phenomenological approach with those sorts of creative uptakes, you know. But I don't know. I mean, I guess if I can allude to a text that I was talking about, I just gave another talk earlier this week, and there's a great BBC TV show called Detectorists about metal detectors, and it's about these metal. It's a fictional show based on these metal detectorists who find us. They're looking for a Saxon hoard, and again, you can do. The show's amenable to a particular kind of political reading, in terms of, like, I was reading it in terms of Brexit, and I'm just, just trying to think about what it means in the context of England and Britain kind of rethinking its relationship to the rest of the world. But again, it didn't really allow me to capture what's going on for the characters in that story. So I guess that's why I kind of came back to the emotional and this idea of a kind of a Stimmung. But I guess in your case, I mean, is it that you're trying to, is the difficulty in trying to understand the particular kind of pull of those German saints, or what is it?
Of that saints, that collective sanctity, to be meaningful, in so much cultures.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I would be really overstretching myself to have much to say about religious, what particular kind of religious attraction they would have. But I would want to say that, again, maybe some different version of what I'm talking about might apply there. That we've got our historical and political kind of frame for talking about how those saints got there, went to all these different places, and how, the Jesuits, any kind of account of the Jesuits, is amenable to a particular kind of, again, political reading that would be completely just. But as you say, there's a certain indefinable thing around how is it then that these particular figures then take, in a whole range of different spiritual or kind of worshipping environments. Again, I would be really out of my depth to be able to answer that in terms of, say, religious thinking or particularly religions in such kind of varying environments as the ones that you've described. I would be that really sort of making it up if I started trying to answer that question. But I guess, maybe where we're on the same page is trying to kind of pinpoint what is the sort of indefinable appeal or attraction that comes along with all of the forms of appeal that we can readily account for through history and sort of ideological readings. So I'm in no way wanting to ditch ideological readings. I think they do a lot of great work, but I suppose there's that sort of, how do you then account for that other experience, the experience of coming into contact with those things.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That helps.
Did it? That's good.
Okay. So, final call. Do we have any questions? Come on, people. Last chance. Speak now or never. Oh, someone raised a hand. We do have a brave soul. Haoni, go on, please.
Hi, you hear me?
Very low.
Hi.
All right. Louise, Cantigas de Santa Maria is one example of cultural diversity, both in music and poetry, that has been extensively exalted as an European cultural prowess since the 19th century more frequently. And it has been interpreted as a cultural jewel of European music, medieval music, rather than a symbol of cultural diversity. This has been in debate since the 70s and more frequently today, the Arabic influence in the cantigas. And my question is, the denial of long-term cultural diversity is a way to undermine regional or minority identities, creating an artificial cultural cohesion. The denial of this would be strongly as it is, if if this conservative historical bias would have such a strength without the ideological nationalistic weight connected with the dogmatic, folkloric or religious cohesions and poor critical thinking exercise due to bad, limited functionalistic education.
I agree. Are you asking me to just comment on that, or?
No. The actual question it is if this conservative bias would have such a strength, if there was no such nationalistic, dogmatic, bad education, critical thinking exercises.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
I'm posting here in the text.
Yeah, sorry. I'm probably
if the bias would happen if we didn't have this heavy things
right.
compressing the critical exercise of history in
right
society.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, I mean, well, I think that's a great question. I suppose we have it, and we and we see how these kinds of these narrow modes of thinking certainly emerge from it. I mean, so this is, I suppose, the kind of other part of what I've been talking about, and I hope I'm answering your question correctly here, is that that absolutely the kinds of examples, I suppose, the tropes and the particular dominant medievalisms that then get the traction and get the kind of momentum that they get are certainly symptomatic of certain kind of biases, which then are kind of uncritically reproduced. So yeah, I mean, for all my sort of talk of individual, experiential medievalisms, that absolutely, there are these framing. I'm just sort of looking at, these dogmas, as you say, that I'm trying to think of in Australia whether we'd have, I suppose St. George might be the one that crops up a lot in Australian culture, although I don't think it's quite as dogmatically used. So I guess, I suppose if we didn't have them, if we didn't have those conservative and as you say, sort of functionalistic and limited ways of conveying that religious past and sure, I don't think we would have, I think we'd have quite a different kind of picture in terms of what's exalted. I mean, I don't know that much about what you're discussing, except sort of, I suppose, natively as a Catholic, but I don't know. I mean, what's been your experience of examining the Cantigas and that sort of afterlife?
Well, it's like that. There is a metric system that uses the Parisian percussion schemes, and if you try to understand the cantigas by that rhythm, sometimes it don't make sense, just the rhythm feelings, and the styles and modes, musical modes, also must be sometimes attributed to Arabian modes,
right?
And there was some sort of whitewashing on it, trying to interpret it as a descendant of French troubadour, Occitan troubadours, and it couldn't be further from the truth, because you see, it was much more diverse than it looks. It's actually heavily, like the majority of it is influenced by Arabian music and poetry and metrics. And it took such a long time to be interpreted as that, because we have this positivism in the 19th century. So it is becoming like very clearly shown how even curricular interpretations of things must be, made better.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I'm sorry if it took me a while to grasp where you were going. I mean, I agree with you, and I think it's, you know, as somebody who teaches English literature, for instance, or, you know, I can teach a little bit of sort of, you know, French in translation in the context of talking about English literature. You know, I'm somebody who, because of the place where I teach, I'm quite constrained about what I can do with talking about medieval knowledge and medieval literature. But I, these days, am much more careful about wanting to really trace, you know, where we can see cross-cultural elements, and where we, you know, and at least offer to my students some of the theories that people have. I'm not going to sort of just walk in and go, because it would be a little bit incorrect of me to say, oh, all of this goes back to Arabic poetry. But I always try to now say to my students, look, you know, it's quite important for us when we're working on this kind of literature to be aware of all of the different theories there are around cultural inheritance and cultural sharing, et cetera, because I'm quite constrained about what I'm allowed to teach. I can't just change my curriculum and say, right, that's it, we're not going to do English literature anymore. But I do try to unsettle that idea of what's meant by sort of English or French literature, et cetera, when I'm teaching now. And so I think that we are, a lot of what's happened in the field over the last few years, I think has just made us a little bit more attentive, even those of us who can't do a lot about the curriculum that we're teaching, just making sure that we're not doing what you're describing. We're not trying to, sorry, you know, in your case, you know, try to force the cantigers into a kind of a percussive system that's incorrect for it and reductive, and not attentive to all the kind of cross-cultural you know, elements within the text. I try to just be much more careful about that now, and I completely agree with you. I think that you know, in our teaching now, it really is a space where we can be much more, well, we just really have to do a little bit more careful work about not just reproducing really limited ideas about cultural inheritance, and staying within that kind of national mentality of talking about cultural products like literature or music. So I agree with you. You know, I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, thanks for answering. I'd just like to point out how hard it is to you know, part ways with some most of the literature is historiography about medieval stuff that they're so like Eurocentric that it just make hard for us to look at it in more diverse way, and is a huge way to go, diversity.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like really interesting work you're doing. So good luck with fighting back against what you're finding is constraining you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Haoni. Louise, do you have disposition for one more question? We have a hand raised in the chat.
If other people can handle it, they're not all desperate to leave. I can take another one quickly.
If we can handle Bolsonaro as president, we can handle
right. Okay, you've got a high pain threshold.
Yeah. So, Leandro.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thanks. First of all, I want to thank you, Professor Louise, for the wonderful presentation. I admit that until now there are some ideas that are cooking in my head, and perhaps only in 8-9 hours I can fully digest them to ask what I really have to my head. And also, I want to ask the whole group of medieval studies of Unimontes for this wonderful, very productive weekend, if we can say so, for the medieval studies and medievalism. My question is somewhat related to what I study. However, although I'm a true student of the Middle Ages, I study ecclesiology in Kievan Rus. However, my question is somewhat tied to medievalism, because it's how some authors tend to perceive medieval Rus, like especially when I have this side project that hopefully will get published soon whenever I finish it, that is analyzing medievalism in historiography that deals with the Russian Revolution. And what I could perceive so far from people like Trotsky, from people like Richard Pipes, so it's kind of the opposite spectrum of both left and right policies and ideologies writing about the same event, is that they try to shove down these Middle Ages in Russia. However, there comes a conundrum because it's not necessary that Russia did not have a Middle Ages, because depending on how we understand the Middle Ages, it existed, it had a kingdom, between many quotations, if I use the kingdom of Rus, as Christian Raffensperger says. But what Pipes, Trotsky, and other authors, including Brazilian, the eminent historian Daniel Arão, who's probably the biggest authority on the team here, they try to shove this almost French Western feudalism to justify that Russia was medieval in the 19th century and start of the 20th century. And this also ties to a current on Slavic studies, most notably on the United States, that are trying to incorporate both Russia and Ukraine, or Rus, if you call that, in a Middle Ages. If most of these scholars, they are trying to say, oh no, Rus was part of Middle Ages because of this aspect and this aspect and this aspect. However, Russian and Ukrainian historiography, they do not tend to call them their period like that. They acknowledge that they had ties with the rest of medieval Europe and also medieval Asia for that matter, but they use other terms. Russia, that I have more familiarity with because my Ukrainian is rather poor. They call their period Ancient Rus, Drevny Ruski, the Drevny Ruski period, which would last from the 9th century to the 16th. If we would approximate what this concept of what Middle Ages, we conclude the Illuministic period of negativeness, it would only be from 16th onwards, the so-called time of troubles. So after all this roundabout that I'm making, sorry, I would ask that if we aren't trying to shove an idea, if we aren't, by applying medievalism to places that deny having a Middle Ages, but this term of Middle Ages, isn't it a type of colonialism, just like you wonderfully said about the global Middle Ages, that sometimes being this global, we are trying to force down a liberal view, globalism, not globalism. Globalism is the thing that traditionalists hate, but a globalized period. If giving medievalism to these societies that do not understand themselves as having Middle Ages, if we aren't trying to colonize them. So thanks again. I hope I've been as clear as possible.
Yeah, no, you are. I mean, I can only agree with you. Yes, I think what you're raising is, that sometimes what we have to kind of look at, well, what's at stake for the people who want to apply that description. And I mean, I think that's a question. It sounds like the conference has been. We've been, that people have been asking that question about themselves, and I continue to ask it about myself. In your case, is it Pipes and Trotsky? You'd be asking, well, what's at stake for them in wanting to do that, in wanting to make that description, if there is significant grounds for resisting that particular description. I read a really nice article, totally unrelated to Russia and the Ukraine, but I read an article by a South Asian historian and historiographer, Daud Ali, and he talks about the use of the word medieval in Indian and South Asian historiography, and the way in which it's a word that everybody has seemed to, for some reason, agreed to use, in spite of the fact it's a completely Western term and doesn't apply to them. But the way they've applied it in that field is they just basically, it gets moved around, it gets applied to totally different dates depending on which historian is using it, but it always signifies that the time before modernity. So whatever people nominate to be modernity, Indian modernity, is the cutoff point for the Indian medieval, in spite of the fact everybody agrees at some level they're using the term purely to signify the pre-modern. So, you know, I guess it sounds like what you're kind of looking at is people who are invested in the modern, you know, because I mean, I'm coming back to, you know, this is kind of medievalism 101, I suppose now, but that idea that when people nominate something as medieval, what they're wanting to do is impose an idea of pre-modernity. So that's the investment in modernity that makes them do it. And so even though, as you say, people are kicking and screaming and saying we don't see ourselves as medieval, the investment for the people using the word is to establish what they think the modern is, and then to back construct the medieval from that, you know. So I was thinking while you were talking, mentioning feudalism, I was thinking about again, Kathleen Davis, who I have a lot of admiration for her work, and in periodization and sovereignty. I always get mixed up if it's sovereignty and periodization or periodization and sovereignty. I think it's periodization and sovereignty. She talks about that whole idea of the, you know, the juridical tradition is basically coming up with an idea of what feudalism is, in order to, again, narrate an idea of the pre-modern. If you haven't read it, you probably find it very interesting in relation to what you're talking about. But yes, I agree with you. I think that, you know, we're getting to a point where we have to be incredibly vigilant and critical about the use of the term.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful answer, and just something that I just remember right now back of my head. This movement, there's a movement in the historiography, especially regarding medieval Ukraine, between many quotations, because of course Ukraine didn't exist until the contemporary period. But people started calling you a medieval Ukraine, or saying that Rus was medieval, Rus was part of Europe after the Crimean attack by Putin. From what I'm understanding, it's kind of by taking Ukraine and putting into Europe, they are somewhat separating from that other world, from the Orientalistic part of Europe that they deny calling Europe. And it also reminds me of, I think it was Oskar Halecki. He has a book about periodization of European history and geography, that he coins the term Central Europe, just to take out the area that he says that it as part of communism, it has been quote unquote corrupted by communism, but it still is Europe. And there's a part that he maps out Middle Ages of both Western Europe and this Central Europe, to say that it's the same thing. However, Oskar Halecki, he was a conservative thinker, not that he was a bad historian, but this conservatism, it was obvious. He was also a Catholic activist. The preface of the book that I mentioned, it was, for example, by Christopher Dawson, who explains also a lot in his preface of what he thinks and how he's reshaping the Europe aside from that one that is still oppressed. And so it's that. But again, thanks a lot for the answer. I didn't know the book by Davis. I'm going to search it and obtain as soon as possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you for telling me about Halecki too. That's really interesting. Another thing I don't know on the long list of things I don't know.
Just a quick input on this discussion before we wrap things up.
Yeah.
But I think an interesting Brazilian example to what we've both been talking would be how some people could argue that using the term medievalism when talking about Brazil can be colonizing, and I would totally agree. But then we have things like Bolsonaro's supporters claiming the Middle Ages and using medieval Templar memes. So I think when we're talking about them, that's perfectly fine because, well, they started.
Yes, and that's, sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it.
Well, that's kind of like the example I was using before about, you know, cathedrals in Macau or something, you know, that you can still find straight up medievalism in, you know, in places outside of Europe that are alluding specifically to the Middle Ages. They're the easy examples. They're the ones we can all feel comfortable about calling medievalism. It's the others that start getting harder to, when it's about the actual kind of local long history. That's when it starts to get much more complicated. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Louise. So
no worries.
Let's wrap things up. Do you have any final considerations or words before I pass to Vinicius so he can do the final thanks?
No, just to say thank you very much. Thank you for the people who've stayed on. I know it's a really long day for you, and I appreciate you giving me your time. And thank you so much, Louise, for inviting me. And I wish I could have been more involved than I was, but it's been lovely to come and chat with all of you. So thanks very much. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Vinicius?
Well, once again, I would like to thank you, Louise, and thank to Richard too, for the marvelous keynotes we had, you know, and all the other colleagues over the world and all over Brazil, which kindly accepted our invitation or responded to our call for papers enthusiastically. Well, we had so much more than we have planned originally. And thank wholeheartedly to Louise, Carolina, and all of our group of monitors from GEM or not. You know, a good measure of the success of our conference is direct result of your hard work in those 3 long days. You know? And thank you all, and I hope to encounter all of you in our next conference. After all, that was only the first one.
You guys are busy. You're very active. It's fantastic. I envy it. I envy the group kind of energy you have. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you, Louise.
Oh, well, so thank you all, really. This has been marvelous. I'm closing the stream right now. Stop recording, everyone smile, and